Our next witness will be Dr. Dean Baker, and after that will be Yona Rosen. Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairwoman Lieberman and members of the board. Appreciate the opportunity to address the board about these issues. Let me just say I'm Dean Baker. I'm co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which I'll also point out we do not get any funding from organized labor. We've been misrepresented that way in many cases, so just to be clear on that. What I want to talk about today are the findings from two studies done by my colleague, Dr. John Schmidt, along with a research associate, Ben Zipper. Dr. Schmidt's currently out of the country, which is the reason why he's not here to talk about these today. I'll do my best to try to explain the findings as clearly as possible. The two studies involve updates of research that looked at the probability of workers, pro-union workers, being dismissed in the course of an organizing campaign. This line of research dates back to a paper done by Harvard Law School professor Paul Weiler in 1983, where he looked at the number of workers who had been reinstated by the NLRB and compared that to the number of people who had voted for union representation in NLRB certified elections. And he came to the conclusion that 1 in 20 workers who supported a union had been fired and subsequently reinstated by the NLRB. His work was criticized by a 1981 paper by University of Chicago economists Robert Lalonde and law professor Bernard Meltzer, who looked over the data and looked at it and assessed that many of the workers that had been reinstated were not in fact involved in organizing campaigns. They did their own analysis of the data and came up with the conclusion that roughly 1 in 60 pro-union workers had been reinstated by the NLRB. So the probability of being fired if you were a union supporter by their calculation was 1 in 60. I should also point out that this was the same methodology that the Dunlop Commission adopted in looking at this issue back in the early 90s. Schmidt and Zipper thought to update this, again, using the same methodology as Lalonde and Meltzer, the more conservative methodology, and they looked at NLRB data through the year 2005. And what they found was that through the period 1996 to 2000, there was a 1.2% probability of someone being fired for being involved in an organizing drive. And for the more recent period, the last period they looked at, 2000 and 2005, it was 1.9%. Now, this may have been somewhat of an understatement because it had become increasingly common at that point for unions to use majority sign-up as a route for representation rather than going through an NLRB certified election. So they sought to adjust their data for the number of workers who were involved in organizing campaigns that went through the process of majority sign-up or card check rather than union election, NLRB election. And they calculated based on two different data sources that ratio, the total number of people recognized to those recognized through NLRB elections, was roughly 1.3. So if they made an adjustment for that, in effect increased the number of people who supported unions by a factor of 1.3, they calculated that roughly 1% of workers involved in pro-union workers in the period 96 to 2000 had been fired, reinstated by the NLRB, and 1.4% in the period 2000 and 2004. I'll just quickly mention a couple issues here that have been raised as to why it might be higher and lower. One is there have been some issues raised that the percentage of workers who are reinstated who were involved in organizing campaigns actually might be somewhat lower than Lalonde and Meltzer had estimated back in the early 90s. Insofar as that's the case, that would mean that they've overstated the probability. There are two reasons why they may have understated the probability. One is simply that many cases may get settled. If an employer knows that they're likely to lose a case before the NLRB, they may voluntarily reinstate the worker. That person would not be counted in this data. The second reason, of course, is that many workers may choose voluntarily not to pursue a case to the NLRB because it couldn't be a time-consuming process, and the sanctions, the reward for doing so may be relatively small. They may not care that much about reinstatement. Okay, should I continue? Your show. Oh, yeah, okay, so I'll pick that up. Okay, so I was saying 2 reasons why this might understate the probability of dismissal is, first off, that in many cases it may end up being the case that there's a settlement. If an employer knows that they're likely to lose the case, they'll voluntarily reinstate the worker. The second issue is that many workers may choose not to pursue it because they don't care that much about getting their former job back. So the question is, how do we think about this 1.9% probability of workers being wrongfully fired? I would just make the point that may not seem that great, but it's reasonable to assume that employers tend to target union organizers, the most active workers. If we say 1 in 10 workers are union organizers, then we could say that there's roughly a 14 to 19% probability of dismissal, which we might think would very importantly influence campaigns. Just briefly pointing out that in the second paper by Schmidt and Zipper, they did look at the probability of a campaign, of an organizer being fired in the course of a campaign, and they concluded that in roughly 26% of organizing campaigns, there was at least one case where a worker was fired and subsequently reinstated by the NLRB. So I would suggest that the risk of firing is an important factor as it stands now in union elections, union organizing campaigns. Thank you.
It's just one. Is there any empirical study that correlates the risk of being subject to an unfair labor practice by an employer with the length of the campaign period?
None that I know of. If one is taking place, I just have to say I don't know of it.
Can I ask you a question? You are an economist, am I
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
This may be an unfair question just to pop on you, but I don't know if you've heard some of our speakers have cautioned us against engaging in this rulemaking or changing rules as we have proposed at this time of economic crisis. They've cautioned that this is the wrong time to be changing the rules, that it will end up being detrimental to the economy. Do you care to engage in that discussion?
I would say it's hard to see directly how it would have a negative impact on the economy. I mean, it's, you'd have to see exactly how this was implemented and what the full ramifications would be. But it's important to understand the main reason that we're in this economic downturn is we don't have enough purchasing power. We have a very unbalanced economy. There's been huge upward redistribution of income from the bulk of the working population to those at the top end who tend to spend less of their income. So insofar as we do measures, and unionization clearly is an important force towards equalizing wages, this is very well documented. So insofar as there are measures that result in more income going to those at the middle and bottom of the distribution rather than those at the top, there's no doubt that would be a plus in our current economic situation. So, if you end up with a real mess of an organizing process and workplaces are all tied up, one can imagine very bad situations. But I'd have to say, I don't think that's the likely outcome of this story.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thanks very much for giving us your perspective.